This is the Fleming Foundation 2018 Summer Symposium, with a lecture from Dr. Thomas Fleming entitled, Cicero Saves the Republic.
Once upon a time, long ago, but no farther away than Rockford's public high schools, schoolboys were required to learn Latin, to read Cicero's orations against Catiline, and even to memorize the beginning of the first Catilinarian oration. Quo usque tandem abutere Catilina patientia nostra, quam diu etiam furor iste tuus nos eludet, quem ad finem sese frenata iactabit audacia, nihilne te nocturnum praesidium palati, nihil urbis vigiliae, nihil timor populi, nihil concursus bonorum omnium, nihil hic munitissimus habendis senatus locus. That's perhaps enough for now. Today, if teachers, let alone students, were told this, that is, that once upon a time we memorized these things, they would undoubtedly reply, whatever. Or if they were particularly intelligent and articulate, they might ask, why? Why did those poor kids have to study Latin? Why did they read Cicero? And above all, why was the first Catilinarian so important to them? Remember did anybody here take Latin and the first thing you learned was Latin is a dead language, as dead as it can be. First it killed the Romans, now it's killing me. Nobody learned that as a child? Okay. Now, in planning this seminar, I wanted to answer some of these questions. And this evening, I hope to provide at least part of an answer to the last question, why is the first Catilinarian so important? Before attempting an answer, though, I'm going to have to clear away some of the obstacles to our perspective. We're all of us prisoners of our own time and place, and it is the rare historian or scholar who can free himself from the shackles of his own identity, his nation, his culture, his religion, his station in life. And for us poor, pathetic, postmodern humans, ideology, which is the ugliest of prejudices. Narrow-mindedness can, of course, be a blessing, since it encourages people to enjoy the here and now of an existence, no matter how banal. But for people trapped in an evil age, the denizens of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the victims of an oppressive ideological empire such as the USSR or our own USSA, one of the best escape routes from this hell on earth we've made is to understand past ages. I won't say the Roman Republic or 17th century England were heaven on earth, far from it. But they do offer alternative ways of living and of thinking about living. Matthew Arnold once famously said that someone who knows only the Bible knows not even that one book. Whether Arnold's dictum was true about the Bible or not, it is beyond all doubt that he who knows only the world of the present knows not even that age. But how do we escape from the nightmare created by public schooling and mass culture? The past few months, I've tried to imagine what it would be like to have direct access to men of other ages. Suppose a man or woman were afflicted with the power to visit, either in body or mind, other periods of history, and that he could talk to people from the age of Cicero or the age of Dante. Imagine such a person were to return to the last pre-Christian century. That is the first century BC. Swooping down out of eternity into time, he would have a bird's eye view of Italy in 106, the year a son was born in the town of Arpinum to the well-off Roman knight Marcus Tullius Cicero and his wife Helvia. 106 was the year between the first two consulships of Gaius Marius, Arpinum's most celebrated resident, a man who rose to power on the strength of his courage, undoubted military talents, and resolute character. In those days, Rome, though mistress of the world, was facing war on two fronts. In Numidia, the faithless Roman ally Jugurtha was successfully evading defeat and capture. And by the way, Sallust's essay on the Jugurthine War is contemporary with the period we're studying. It makes very good reading. Northern Italy, on the other hand, was alarmed by the success in southern Gaul of an invading confederation of Germanic tribes, the Teutons and the Cimbri, although there may have been some Celtic element there. Whenever there's hell-raising to be done, you can certainly find Celtic people joining in. Still taking the bird's-eye view, our time traveler shifts his gaze ahead 63 years to the year 43. Little Cicero, whom he had just seen being born, has now been murdered at the orders of Marcus Antonius and his young ally Octavian, whose great-uncle, the dictator Caesar, had been assassinated the year before. In one lifetime, the Roman Republic followed the trajectory of a Greek tragedy from success to arrogance to ruin, but with this difference: older and with the wisdom that comes from suffering, as in a Greek tragedy, Octavian, as the first ruler of the newly formed Roman Empire, would preside over a political, military, and cultural revival that would, with many vicissitudes, keep Rome on top for over 4 centuries. So it has something of a happy ending. And Cicero has a great deal to do with it. We do not have the advantages of our time traveler. We cannot interview Cicero, his friends, or his enemies. We are, however, fortunate in having a wealth of first-rate documents to help us. Cicero's speeches and letters, for example, his works on philosophy and rhetoric, the military commentaries of his friend and enemy, Julius Caesar, the histories written by Sallust, the poems of Catullus, and the curious writings of Cicero's friend Varro on agriculture and chronology. Later ages will give us Plutarch and Suetonius to read, and a host of historical writers who drew on the sources, that is, from Cicero's contemporaries. If we can once disabuse ourselves of certain flattering notions about our own uniqueness and importance, what often on talk radio goes by the name of American exceptionalism, our superiority, we may, if we can do this, be able to understand not only Cicero's age, but perhaps our own. The age of Cicero experienced the death throes of the old Roman Republic. Although it might be said of those times that everyone in politics made himself a party of one, there were, very broadly speaking, 2 confederations of interest, 2 sort of factional alignments. On the right, if we can use that misleading terminology, on the right was the party of the entrenched authority of the Senate, led by powerful men of noble family who had commanded armies and held the consulship. On the left was the party of innovation. We might call it the party of revolution and progress, also led by powerful noblemen who had commanded armies. If we take them on their own account, that is, not cynically, but if we listen to what these men say, the conservatives were the bony, the good men, men of distinguished family, fine careers of public service, devoted to the well-being of the Roman Commonwealth. The revolutionaries were populares. They were the men of the people, democratically minded noblemen who wished to reform the corruption of the Senate and to send off to the provinces Roman administrators who did something other than loot and oppress their provincial victims. The contest, then, was not merely a conflict between opposing class interests or a struggle for power among egoists. It was a contest whose central issue was how the Roman future would be defined. What would it be like? What would its institutions be like? And who would be rewarded? I'm going to suggest this evening that one of history's greatest political losers, Marcus Tullius Cicero, became in the end the man who would determine the shape of the future empire. And I'll also talk about this subject in my talk on the Roman Cicero, the defender of the Republic. While this contest for power entered its final phase during the career of Cicero, it by no means began in the 1st century BC. According to ancient traditions, the descendants of Trojan hero Aeneas, Romulus and Remus, founded a settlement on the Palatine Hill in 753 BC. And after a period of monarchy and Etruscan rule, Roman aristocrats expelled the royal Tarquins in 509 and established a res publica, the people's business or commonwealth. Rome gradually expanded to rule all of Latium, that is the territory around Rome, which is now still an administrative district of the Italian state, then all central Italy, and eventually spread its both south and north to control most of the peninsula. The greatest challenge came in 3 wars with Carthage, the Phoenician state in North Africa. These were the Punic Wars, which began in the struggle over who would control the Greek cities of Sicily and southern Italy. This was from 264 to 146. The first and second Punic Wars were a close run. In the second, the Romans faced an invasion of Italy led by the brilliant Carthaginian commander Hannibal. But under the leadership of the elder Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Romans invaded North Africa and forced Carthage to capitulate. The third Punic War was largely a cleanup operation. Along the way, the Romans also conquered the Greek kingdoms and confederations that grew up after the death of Alexander the Great. By 146, Rome was undoubted ruler of the Mediterranean world, and in the following years, her power would extend from the Middle East all the way to the south of France and Spain. Empire always comes at a high price. Roman farmers were impoverished by their constant military service, and the gap between rich and poor was growing ever wider and deeper, as it has been over the past 5 or 6 decades in the United States. Roman senators and the knights, or equites, that is, people who could afford a horse, afford to enter the Senate, but stayed out of politics, they belonged to the higher property classes, they reap most of the benefits. But instead of joining forces, the senators and the knights spent most of their time quarreling over their privileges and over access to boodle. High on the list of boodle-producing activities was public contracting, just as it is today, especially the collection of taxes in the provinces, because tax collecting down into the early empire was a question of private corporations. And by the way, this was revived in Germany down to 19th century. There were still tax collecting corporations. If you have read your Gospels, you know the constant denunciation that Jesus has to face from the Pharisees because he eats with publicans and sinners. And when I was growing up, I thought publicans were bartenders because that is a nickname for them. But of course, no, these are people who work for these private equestrian corporations to collect the taxes. You make a bid. Like, I'll collect all the taxes for Rockford for $10 million or whatever, and if you make $15 million, you make $5 million on the deal. And so the temptation, obviously, for the publicans was to squeeze as much as they could, and in this, with a little bribe given to a governor, the troops would come in and help them. That's why John the Baptist says to the soldiers. He doesn't say, throw away your swords, forget about fighting. He says, don't oppress the people. That is, don't lend yourself to this dishonorable mean. Now, in their contest for power, wealthy Romans, knights and senators, built coalitions, which the Roman name is friendships, and attracted followers and dependents known as clients. And the whole interlocking system of patrons and clients is a metaphor that goes throughout the whole Roman world. One famous Roman historian about 20 or 30 years ago, Paul Vane, said the nearest thing in the modern world to the way that the Roman Republic and Empire were run was a certain organization. By the way, Rockford was once the number 4 town for mafia income in the entire United States, according to the FBI. Even in the Roman Senate, wealth and power were dominated by a small group of noble senators. These were people who had at least one ancestor who had risen to hold the highest offices. Ambitious politicians who tried to climb the ladder of power, the so-called cursus honorum, it's like a race course of public honors, without such an ancestor to back them, were called novi homines, new fellas. It's sometimes translated new men, but homines, it doesn't have that resonance of man, which in Latin is vir, not homo. In the 130s and 120s, the Gracchus brothers took their campaign for reform and land distribution to the point of open rebellion. No matter how honorable their intentions may have been, they became traitors, as Cicero later said, to the Commonwealth. The Gracchi were killed, but the problem did not go away. That is the problem of unequal distribution of wealth, the constant call for agrarian reform. The end of the century, that is the end of the 2nd century, witnessed the rise of Gaius Marius, the plebeian from Arpinum who was vaguely connected to Cicero. Depending on whom you spoke with, Marius was either Rome's greatest leader, a patriot, or a ruthless tyrant. I would think he was both. Eventually, Marius was opposed and defeated by one of his own lieutenants, a luxury-loving nobleman named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla had served under Marius in the campaign against Jugurtha. In the struggles between Marius and Sulla, both sides practiced mass executions and confiscations of property. They would just draw bliss. Okay, you're on the wrong side, so I get everything you've got. I'll kill you and your brother and your pet monkey. Their soldiers were no longer patriotic farmers, but partisans who expected to be paid out of the spoils of war. Sulla was made dictator in 83 and used his power to impose a conservative restoration in which the Senate regained lost privileges and the growing power of the Roman mob was tamed for the moment. It was in those days that Cicero made his first recorded speech in defense of the younger Sextus Roscius. It was a complicated case, which I'm not going to go into tonight because everybody seems to be on the wrong side of everything. But Cicero's problem was that his daring defense of the younger Roscius did not endear him to the dictator Sulla. And for one reason or another, he went on a grand tour to complete his education. First to Rhodes, which was famous for its philosophers and rhetoricians, then to Asia Minor and Athens. Miraculously, Sulla retired. He was happily married to like a 17-year-old girl and died in bed. And that's one of the most extraordinary feats to accomplish for somebody who has held supreme power at the end of a civil war. But like most restorations, Sulla's proved to be temporary. It was not so much that his vision was defective as it was that it was implemented too late. It might have succeeded 100 or perhaps even 50 years earlier before the time came when a successful general could hire an army and engage in a contest for dictatorial power. In earlier times, an ambitious politician aimed at achieving dignitas, honor, prestige, respect from his fellow citizens. And he did this by discharging his duties as a soldier, a citizen, a statesman. But a new generation of Roman aristocrats had come to manhood during Sulla's wars with Maria. These were men who aimed at more than mere dignitas, or whose concept of dignitas was more regal than republican. Men who knew that neither armies nor the Roman Senate were among the things that money cannot buy. They also knew that foreign wars and proconsular commands of provinces were sources of the money they would need, and they had small remorse for the violent acts and even less pity for the victims living in Rome's misgoverned and exploited provinces. And if all that stood in their way was either the power of Sulla's restored Senate, they had learned from the Gracchus brothers and from Marius how to appeal over the heads of the conscript fathers of the Senate directly to the people. By the way, one of the most frightening things any president has done in my lifetime was when Ronald Reagan said he would appeal over the heads of the media, the elite, the Congress, directly to the people. Nothing could be more dangerous. Now, it all sounds democratic, but so did FDR's fireside chats and Newt Gingrich's contract with America. Or, for that matter, Bernie Sanders talks like he believes in democracy. Consider briefly the career of Sulla's lieutenant Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was only 30 when he was granted that extraordinary surname, the Great. Victorious over the Marians in Africa and over rebels in Spain, he always managed to be there to pick up the laurels that other men had earned, from Lucullus in Asia, from Marcus Crassus in the war with Spartacus. Far from untalented, Pompey was a careful planner whose magnificent victories were owed in part to his insistence on having overwhelming superiority on the day of battle. He may not have always been, as to paraphrase Bedford Forrest, the first, but he always had the most. Unfortunately, Pompey had ambitions that outran his abilities. He did not aim at dictatorship, but he was vain, jealous of other men's accomplishments, sensitive to critiques or disagreement, and he was swayed by the mob. A far better man in many respects than Gaius Marius, Pompey shared Marius' suspicious nature and his lack of vision. Unfortunately, he lacked Marius' ability to take decisive action at the critical moment. 3 years after Sulla's death, King Mithridates of Pontus, who had troubled the Middle East with his anti-Roman uprisings, made one more attempt to create an Asian empire independent of Rome, this time backed by troops sent by Roman rebels in Spain. Lucius Lucullus adroitly maneuvered for the command, and both as a commander and as a governor, Lucullus performed brilliantly, curbing the extortions of the Roman tax farmers, reducing the debts of the provincials, and defeating, time after time, the much larger armed forces sent against him. He would have conquered all of Parthia and Armenia had he not been undermined by the tax farmers who stirred up trouble against him in Rome because he was interfering in their profits, and by a large part of the army that complained about the length of time the war was taking, and also they complained about Lucullus' preference to fighting strategic battles instead of looting wealthy cities. They were egged on by Lucullus' own brother-in-law, one Publius Claudius Pulcher, who would come to play an important part in Cicero's career. With little left to do but the mopping up, Lucullus' enemies arranged for him to be superseded by Pompey in the year 67. This is only 4 years before Cicero's consulship, and the year in which he was getting elected praetor, which is a top judicial office in Rome, the next stage before the consulship. If Pompey thought he was going to have everything in his own way at Rome, he was quickly disabused. He was a very successful commander, but there were other routes to power at Rome. For example, Marcus Licinius Crassus acquired great wealth with which he hoped to buy power, and a young Gaius Julius Caesar. Despite his aristocratic family background and connections, he was a ruthless and clever political fixer, more like one of the Daly family. These three men, rivals though they were, would ultimately join forces and first divide up the Republic and then destroy it. Pompey and Crassus were in perpetual rivalry with each other. While Pompey was piling up victories, Crassus was piling up riches somewhat in the manner of a Russian gangster banker. One of Crassus' great schemes was he created the first Roman fire department. But the purpose was not to lower the rate of destructiveness of the fires, but he'd go in and he'd see some rich man's house burning, and he'd offer 10 cents on the dollar. Then Crassus' firemen would come in and put the fire out. He's not accused of having started the fire anyway. When they got together in an alliance, as they did several times, albeit grudgingly, Pompey and Crassus together were unbeatable. The first occasion was their agreement to share the consulship in the year 70, though their mutual jealousies made effective cooperation very difficult. One of the most notable events during the consulship of Pompey and Crassus was the political trial of Gaius Verres. As governor of Sicily, Verres had outdone all his predecessors and rivals in corruption and theft, and he could afford to retain the greatest legal and political talent of the day. That is Cicero's future friend, Hortensius. The desperate Sicilians turned to Marcus Tullius Cicero, the young orator whose birth at Arpinum we have witnessed. He was a novus homo on the make, and he undertook the prosecution with such panache that Verres went into voluntary exile rather than try to fight the case. Cicero made trips to Sicily interviewing provincial administrator after administrator, interviewing rich people who had been robbed, people whose rights had been abused. He was like Perry Mason, more than like an ordinary trial lawyer. Although Cicero's best friend, Pomponius Atticus, frequently warned him that Pompey was shallow and unreliable, he needed to attach himself to a leader, and he became an uneasy partisan of Pompey. As a result of his checkered alliances, now supporting the Knights, now supporting the Senate, now a Republican, but now a supporter of Pompey, Cicero was viewed with suspicion, both by the leaders of the Populares, the People's Party, and by the Boni, the aristocrats, who thought he was too tied to the business interests of the equestrian order to really serve effectively as their spokesman. But despite opposition, he capped off a successful rise to power by getting himself elected consul for the year 63, the earliest year he would be eligible. His success was not a fluke, nor was it entirely a stroke of genius. There were wheels within wheels, and Cicero, while not exactly loved by any one faction, was not hated by anyone either. He was also, after the prosecution of Verres, the greatest legal orator of his time. By this point in his career, Cicero knew he was entering onto a battlefield that was no metaphor. We talk about entering the political arena or was a political battle. Roman political battles used real weapons. Real people got themselves killed. Now, and talking about Cicero's campaign for the consulship and what he did with it brings up the whole question of how did Roman politics function. And so it's time for us time travelers to land on the ground and take a closer look at the gritty politics of late Republican Rome. Now, I've asked you to read Shackleton Bailey's little book on Cicero, and Shackleton Bailey, among others, treats the crisis in which the Republic perished as largely a contest between ambitious egoists with neither program nor ideology. Describing Cicero's early career in the Senate, he says, "He must not be imagined as a man with a mission to society. A Roman politician did not require a platform. Parties, in the modern sense, did not exist, and nobody was under the necessity of professing a political cause or principle." Observe the precision in which this careful and very fine scholar writes such phrases as "a man with a mission," "did not require a platform," "nobody was under the necessity." Much depends, of course, on what we mean by such terms as mission, platform, party, political cause, or principle. And this is where the problem of perspective comes in, because we can make two mistakes, and both of them involve introducing a modern perspective. Europe and America have been divided by a series of revolutionary movements: the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, the American War between the states, and the Russian Revolution. While the ultimate goals of revolutionaries and the reactionaries who oppose them may often seem murky, one would not have too much trouble ascertaining broad distinctions. Such distinctions as, say, between the programs of Danton, Robespierre, and Babeuf among the Jacobin radicals, and, say, those of Dr. Johnson, his friend Edmund Burke, Walter Scott, or the restored King Louis XVIII. Or, let us just say, there were distinctions between the programs of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. When they look at the ancient world, historians and scholars less astute than Shackleton Bailey are tempted to read in their own aspirations and conflicts. So Pericles and Thucydides become inevitably progressive liberals. Also, by the way, Socrates and Plato. That's what Alan Bloom once told me, that Plato was an advocate of American-style democracy. The Gracchus brothers and Julius Caesar are liberal aristocrats who long to liberate the lower classes from aristocratic oppression. In other words, they're like FDR, Jack Kennedy. Now, Shackleton Bailey is quite right not to fall for this line of thinking. On the other hand, I think it should be clear to anyone who has looked closely at Cicero's work on duties and to his De Republica that he did have a vision of the Commonwealth and an abiding set of principles that guided his statesmanship. That he sometimes, even often, betrayed those principles is no proof of insincerity, His betrayal is only a sign of his humanity and the fact that he was a politician. Cicero, while essentially conservative, had limited appreciation of the dictator Sulla or his methods. After all, Cicero did come from Arpinum, and his own family was connected by marriage with the family of Marius. His mother's nephew, adopted by a relation of Gaius Marius, was brutally executed by Sulla's henchman, Lucius Sergius Catilina. Nonetheless, Cicero believed in the Roman constitutional order in which the Senate played a dominant role as an executive force under the consuls. He also believed in the Concordia Ordinum, the cooperation between the wealthy equites, the knights, and the senatorial leadership. This was the slogan for his consulship, but he put it forward as a basic principle in his work on the Republic. If we turn to the prominent figures on the other side, Catiline, Clodius, Julius Caesar, they viewed the old order as something to be reformed or overthrown, and the Senate as an obstacle to efficient and honest government. When Lily Ross Taylor wrote her fine book on party politics in the age of Caesar, I think she wrote it before I was born, she had more in mind than the mechanics of rounding up votes. She was careful to distinguish Roman political factions from modern parties, and she correctly emphasizes the very important counterforce to party politics, namely amicitia, friendship, formal friendships that connected Roman aristocrats regardless of their party. Clodius, he was a violent popular demagogue, but because he was descended from a great noble family, his violence was often discreetly overlooked by members of his own class, and the same thing is true of Catiline. Always bear in mind that the populares, the People's Party, were a faction of senatorial aristocrats just as much as the boni. This is not a contest between the classes. Friendship, in all its Roman senses, was a moral quality that could rise above party. But there was another moral value, usually expressed, as I've said before, by the word dignitas, which accounted for a great deal of political conduct. Such different personalities as Cicero, Caesar, Pompey, and Sallust were all deeply concerned with saving face, maintaining honor, increasing the esteem in which they were held, and passing that esteem on to their heirs. Julius Caesar says explicitly that when he crossed the Rubicon, in which started the Roman Civil War, he knew he would cause suffering and destruction to a great many people, but the alternative was loss of honor. It's a terrifying admission. Before we leave the question of parties, let us hear Ms. Taylor on the general outlook of the senatorial conservatives, people like Lutatius Catulus or the younger Cato. Roman Republican government, which men of aristocratic sympathies like Polybius, the Greek historian, and his follower Cicero describe as an ideal combination with checks and balances. Monarchy, represented by the consuls, of aristocracy as embodied in the Senate, and of democracy as it was exercised in popular assemblies. And that had, in contrast to the democratic government of Athens, it had always been predominantly aristocratic. For the aristocrats not only controlled the Senate of ex-magistrates, because you had to be a magistrate to get into the Senate, you didn't get elected directly, but it also exercised sufficient power over the assembly of the people to retain an almost complete monopoly on the consulship for members of their own group. It was this tradition of aristocratic power that the populares were determined to break, whether for the sake of the noble ideals expressed by the Gracchus brothers, or in the case of Crassus, Catiline, and Clodius, for the sake of personal aggrandizement, or in the case of Julius Caesar, certainly both. While Cicero was busy getting himself elected and entering into the duties of the consulship, Lucius Sergius Catilina was hatching his plot to overthrow the Republic. Catiline was descended from an ancient family that had enjoyed little repute or success in recent generations, but he was still a patrician. He had served in the army with distinction and supported Sulla against the Marians. It was at this time that he maimed and beheaded Marcus Marius Gratidianus, Cicero's kinsman, who was on Sulla's little list to be eliminated. He's also accused of murdering his first wife in order to marry a woman described as beautiful and wealthy as she was dissolute. He was already notorious as a philanderer when he was accused of having an affair with a Vestal virgin, the half-sister, as luck would have it, of Cicero's wife, Terentia. I mean, when you're dealing with Rome or ancient Athens, you're dealing with something more like Rockford than like New York, where everybody knows everybody's dirty laundry. Lucius Catulus, the acknowledged leader of the aristocratic faction, testified on Catiline's behalf, and he got off. And this is a problem Cicero faces his whole career. Elected praetor in the year 68, Catiline spent the next 2 years as governor in Africa, where he was accused of extortion. He announced his candidacy for the consulship of 65, but his extortion trial excluded him from the elections. He gathered around him a body of dissolute young men who were ready to assassinate the senatorial leadership, particularly the new consul Cicero, whom they despised as an outsider. Meanwhile, the conspirators were recruiting an army in Etruria, that's modern Tuscany. In fact, their headquarters was Faesulae, that is Fiesole, that little town just up the mountain from Florence. They were ready to take Rome by surprise as soon as their leader gave the signal. Now, when he was prosecuting Verres, the governor of Sicily, Cicero had learned several important lessons. First and foremost, he had learned how to collect the facts and put them together as a kind of modern investigator. He was a lawyer detective, as I said, in the mold of Perry Mason, or like an Italian or French magistrate today. In the case of Verres, fact-finding required long trips through Sicily. The crisis of 63 left him no time for such lengthy investigations, as events were moving very quickly. But in putting out feelers and finding spies and informers, the consul proved to be indefatigable in unraveling the plot. You have to understand this because they didn't have police force. They didn't have spies. They didn't have any of the paraphernalia you would use today. They didn't have the FBI, the CIA, or 500 other sets of armed mercenaries who are ready to put you in solitary confinement for having crossed the bureaucracy. When Catiline failed to gain the consulship in the elections held in July, he went forward with Plan B, open rebellion. By early October, there were rumors everywhere, and Marcus Crassus, who had his finger in every little dirty revolutionary pie, received some alarming letters that turned him decisively against Catiline. The first letter he opened warned him to leave Rome before he was massacred with the other rich aristocrats, and a general purge of the nobles. Crassus brought the incriminating correspondence to the consul. Cicero, who was also receiving information from other sources, including the infamous Fulvia, got the Senate to pass the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree of the Senate, which authorizes the consuls to take extraordinary measures to safeguard the Republic, to see to it that the Republic receives no harm. This is essentially martial law. On the 1st of November, the Senate learned that Catiline's confederate Manlius had gone into open rebellion in Etruria. At Rome, the chief conspirators held a meeting at the house of Marcus Porcius Laeca. A few days later, an attempt on Cicero's life failed. People that were supposed to be friends went in to greet him in the morning, and they were going to draw daggers and murder him, but they were denied admittance. Catiline was still prepared to bluff it out and even appeared in the Senate on November 8th, when Cicero's blistering first oration against Catiline drove him out of the Senate, out of Rome, and into open rebellion. Near the end of his first oration, Cicero justifies his tactic of forcing Catiline's hand and allowing him to leave the city and join his army. It is not fear of invidia, ill will, or envy, or the evil eye, because, as he says, when a man is engaged in an important task, when he incurs enmity and hostility, it is really a form of gloria, honor. No, he says, but the Republic is infected with the disease of conspiracy and revolution. To kill Catiline would accomplish little so long as his hundreds and thousands of confederates will continue to plot from within. But by driving him out and forcing the issue, even the most cautious Romans will see that they are facing a greater threat than would be posed by enemy invasion. The only way to cure a malignant tumor is to cut it out. Defeated, Catiline committed suicide, that is in battle, and his principal collaborators were arrested by the consul. And by the way, Sallust's account of the final battle in which all the Catilinarians, despite their low character, they all died with multiple wounds in front. Initially, Cicero portrays them as a bunch of namby-pambies, but Sallust says, they died like noble Romans, even though that's not the way they lived. During the crisis, Cicero was able to put together an alliance between the two orders, the senators and the knights, and the consul was escorted through the streets by a bodyguard of young equites. In expelling Catiline, Cicero saved the Republic and was hailed as its second founder, the father of his country. This is all very extraordinary for an outsider like Cicero, and it clearly went to his head. He made one slight misstep. Using the emergency powers, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, he carried out the Senate's order to put the leaders to death. A young Julius Caesar, who had probably shied away from Catiline's armed revolution at the last minute, warned him that there might be trouble if a death penalty were imposed, but the young Cato persuaded the Senate to vote for execution. The debate over the penalty was a momentous occasion, pitting, as it did, the resolute Stoic Cato against the equally resolute Julius Caesar. The hatred that flared up on that occasion deepened over the years until Cato committed suicide rather than live under Caesar the dictator. For Cicero, the suppression of Catiline was a Pyrrhic victory. While he certainly showed what an energetic and principled consul could do to preserve the Republic, the fact that a scoundrel of so black a hue as Catiline had come so close to overthrowing the Republic revealed the basic weakness in the system. Cicero and Cato had stood up against Caesar in the moment of his career in which he revealed his future greatness. But in securing the death penalty for Caesar's disreputable allies, Cicero unwittingly took the first step towards securing his own execution at the hands of Marcus Antonius. So, that is, in brief, something other people have written thousands of pages of, and you got it in 35, 40 minutes. Thank you very much.